Hi, everybody, and welcome to our talk with José Alaniz, who is going to be speaking today about the Czech graphic memoir Heartcore within the context of the Czech comic scene more broadly. This programming today is brought to you by Arts Multilingual Week, as well as my SENS 308 course on comics and graphic novels. And so we're really excited to be able to discuss and showcase comics that are emerging from other parts of the world, but engaging in transnational discourses of comics and comic studies. So let me introduce our speaker today. José Alaniz is a professor in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures and the Department of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. He's published the monographs Comics, Art in Russia, Death, Disability, and the Superhero, the Silver Age and Beyond, Resurrection, Comics in Post-Soviet Russia, and Comics on the Anthropocene, Graphic Narratives at the End of Nature. He has also co-edited 2 essay collections, Comics of the New Europe, Reflections and Intersections, which I contributed a chapter to, as well as Uncanny Bodies, Disability, and Superhero Comics. He formerly chaired the executive committee of the International Comic Arts Forum and was a founding board member of the Comic Studies Society. And to this in particular, I want to note and express my gratitude for José, because if it weren't for José, I don't think I'd be as involved in comic studies as I am. In 2014, José invited me to also join the board of the International Comic Arts Forum. So he really sort of set me on a path that has taken me to UBC and allowed me to organize the programming that I organize around comics and graphic literature. So in the middle of your bio, a thank you. He has also published on comics and fiction, including The Phantom Zone and Other Stories, The Complete Moscow Calling, Puro Pinche True Fictions. Did I say that all right? Oh, thank you. Tales of Bart, a novel in 3 acts, Moscow 93, the latter 3 from Flower Song Press. His current scholarly projects include a monograph on the representation of historical trauma in Czech graphic narrative. And I think this intersects with that in some interesting ways. So thank you again, José, for joining us. I'm going to pass the mic to you and go get myself a donut.
You want me to talk into this?
If you can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's mine. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Professor Neidham, or do they call you Professor Neidham or Biz? Yeah, I figured.
Doctor.
Dr. Biz. Wow.
It will never be on a license plate, though it's kind of like the perfect thing.
But it sounds like a really hip supervillain. Dr. Biz. Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here with you guys. It's not that far to get here from Seattle, but it's such a wonderful space when I do come, and I've had a great welcome. And Dr. Biz kind of sells herself short, right? Because it's true that I was one of the people who invited her to join the board of the International Comic Arts Forum in 2014, but she actually went to the conference herself and did a wonderful paper. So that was the first thing that got her on our radar. So, you know, it's you have a great person to teach you comics up here. So I'm talking today about Heartcore, which I understand you guys are reading. There's a little story behind that, right? Because I think you asked me several months ago, you were putting this class together and you says, hey, you got something from Eastern Europe that I could kind of throw on the syllabus? And I said, well, as it happens, there's just a brand new translation of this really fascinating memoir, and memoirs are actually kind of new in the Czech scene. So I think your students would benefit from it. So I'm very happy that she put it on the syllabus, and you guys get to interact with this work, which I find pretty fascinating, and I'm going to talk about it today. But I want to give you guys some of the context, both in terms of Czech comics in their native habitat, right, in the Czech Republic, but also as how this works really builds on a lot of stuff that's been done in Czech comics regarding the representation of history and trauma. So that's kind of what I'm going to start with. I should also warn you that this talk does get into some heavy material, pertaining to war, suicide, and sexual trauma. And so just be aware of that. Why don't we start with what it means when we talk about trauma? And so there's been some wonderful work that's been done over about the last 30 years in terms of how to represent trauma and what it means to be in a traumatized position. And so here we have Lee Gilmore, who writes The Limits of Autobiography, a pretty seminal work in this tradition of study. Crucial to the experience of trauma are the multiple difficulties that arise in trying to articulate it. Something of a consensus is already developed that takes trauma as the unrepresentable to assert that trauma is beyond language in some crucial way, that language fails in the face of trauma, and that trauma mocks language and confronts it with its own insufficiency. Right? The idea that words can never quite capture that experience, trauma is too traumatizing, right? And so the real question for people like me and scholars like Hilary Shute, who I think pioneers this branch of study of comics, is how comics can utilize tools that are not available to text exclusively, right? How the combination of words and images might provide new access points for the articulation of trauma on some level, and also for the study of what trauma really means. And so I have a couple of very important books by Hilary Shute, Graphic Women and Disaster Drawn. I'm not even going to be quoting from Hilary Shute in this talk, just because she's become so seminal and so central to my thinking about these questions. But if those of you who are interested can kind of explore these two books, not only are they great in terms of talking about how women are represented in comics, but specifically how trauma, including sexual trauma, how you can kind of talk about that experience of humanity through words and images like comics. So really, this whole talk and a lot of my work is kind of informed by her insights and her ideas. So if we get to the Czech situation, you have to go back in time to about the year 2000, more or less, turn of the century, when you have in the Czech Republic a new movement to legitimize and to expand the market for comics. You should understand, as a lot of you probably know, that the country that was called Czechoslovakia for most of the 21st century was under different kinds of occupation, whether it was part of the Habsburg Empire in the early part of the 20th century, whether it was under Nazi occupation, German occupation during World War II, or whether it was communist in the years after that, up until about 1989. So basically, it's in 1989 that you have the first real opportunity to create a free society that is not being basically occupied or suppressed by other larger powers. It's really when the Czech Republic really becomes free. Whoops. So what I wanted also just to get across here is that that there was no real culture of comics the way we understand it in the West. So those are two important things. Now it's an era of post-communism when there's more freedom of speech, but there's also a free market, right? And there's a lot of chaos with that in the 1990s. But also there's no real tradition of using comics to talk about serious things. Comics were for kids. Comics were things that were not serious. They were disposable trash for the most part. So it is in around 2000 that you start seeing publishers getting in on this this notion of actually bringing comics to adult readers. It takes a little bit longer, of course, there than in other places. This has not been a revolutionary idea in Western Europe or in the United States or in North America for a long time. People started doing that with comics as early as the 1960s, if not even earlier, really. And so, yeah, that it happened so late in Eastern Europe and places like the Czech Republic is a testament to, in a sense, how that culture was being repressed for so long. Anyway, so these publishers, Labyrinth is one of them, the guys who publish Alois Nebel, they get onto this really logically and methodically worked out strategy to bring comics to adult readers and to talk about serious things. How are they going to do that? They're going to talk about things that are familiar to educated adult readers, like Czech history. And as soon as you get into Czech history, you're going to talk about a lot of trauma, right? All of those occupations and all of those suppressions. And so that is exactly what you have with this trilogy of graphic novels, the Alois Nebel trilogy, which on top of talking about all of these traumas of Czech history, especially in the 20th century, is also utilizing very familiar literary tropes. They're using a very old notion in Czech literature, the idea of the little man, right? The malý člověk in Czech, the person who has no power, who just looks at these vast forces of history are unfolding in front of him. That's kind of what you have going on here. It's a story about a man who is kind of a lonely middle-aged figure. That's what he looks like, and he just works as an attendant at a train station in a rural part. So he's basically just watching trains pass by his station all day long. But with this setup, we get really this Gothic story, and by Gothic I mean basically a kind of haunting, a ghost narrative with all of these figures emerging out of the fog, right, out of these trains that he sees, right, that are all clearly not in the present day. They're figures that are from these various traumas of Czech history. The so-called Gothic mode then makes it possible for him to meet Nazis from back in the war. One of them is saying Heil Hitler, as you see here, and they're asking, like, you know, where is this? Like, where do we take the our victims and all these things like that. So Alois Nebel, of course, can't really do anything for these people. He can only really witness these and in a sense, feel the scars of history and all of the millions of people, right, that were killed in the war. At one point, he even sees a train that is passing by, but there are hands that are sticking out, kind of imploring him for help. These are clearly concentration camp bound victims, right? People going to the death camps. But again, all Nebel can really do is just witness it. He can only watch. And so again, right, we have this repetitive kind of trope that's going on here for him, in which the ordinary person, the person beset by history, the person who's not making any decisions, right, can only bear witness to the traumas of the world. And so, you know, it's a funny work in some ways, but it's also a very dark and disturbing work. As you can see, it's in black and white. It uses very stark kind of black-white kind of tones, right? There's no gray. And it's very much all about those kinds of stark differences. Here's an example from late in the book, one of the books, where he is witnessing a whole parade. So it's not a train anymore. Now it's basically these masses of people. They're all ghosts. They're all folks that are either leading the charge to establish a communist state in one panel, or other ones are Holocaust victims, right? You can see one of them has a swastika on there, but all of these people are bound towards death. And all he can do is kind of look down upon them. There's even this very haunting sequence where a little boy, clearly Jewish because he's got a Star of David, is asking him in German, what are you doing here all alone? Are you coming too? And Nebel can't answer him. He can't even say anything, right? So it's in episodes like this that you feel this whole weight of all of this accumulation of human suffering that has been so much of not only of Czech history, but a lot of this region, right? I mean, and Ukraine, of course, is going through another horrible episode right now in that invasion from Russia. So there's that kind of thing that, again, would have been very familiar to adult readers. This is clearly not for kids, even though, again, some of it is funny, but it's clearly something that is asking a lot of a reader to engage with the way that comics can represent history in unique ways. Okay. By the way, I hate to lecture, so if anybody has a question or a clarification, please raise your hand. So based on the success of things like Alois Nebel, you see this tradition really get established in 21st century Czech comics of using both literary and historical themes to appeal to comics readers or to just regular readers, right? And you really see them kind of expanding their market. And it really is a success story. It's a really fascinating story I try to tell in the book about how conscious and planned this strategy really was and how well it works. They're also, because they're talking about Czech history, because they're talking about very important kind of patriotic questions, they get a lot of government funding, right? And so that's also good. So this is a good example. This particular project from about 10 years later, We Are Still at War, which is sponsored by an activist social organization called Postbellum, but it's got a lot of state funding, is not only comics, it's also utilizing oral histories. It's utilizing CDs and DVDs and documentaries and all sorts of stuff on the radio and all sorts of stuff online. So it's really this whole campaign to get these stories from real people, right? They asked real people about their experiences during World War II and during the communist period. And then they work with a comics artist and a writer to put it all into comics form. There was even a very big book launch for it that happens during the big comics festival at Prague in 2011 with the actual people that they interviewed. A lot of them, of course, are very elderly by that point. And again, right, it's a real kind of a celebration and a commemoration of who they were and what they lived through. Okay, I'm going to want to show you a few of these, right? Because some of these pertain to the experience of the Holocaust, not only of Jews, but other folks that were rounded up during World War II and sent to the death camps. And so something like Adam Drda and Miloš Mazal's The Enormous Disk of the Sun, I think gives you a pretty clear kind of narrative of the violence and the inhumanity that was meted out to the to these victims, right? And I'm particularly haunted personally by that third panel in the second tier there, that kind of vertical panel with the little girl who's covering her eyes, and while the German soldier is beating her mother to death. It's a pretty horrifying kind of image. And it's the kind of thing that you can't really do in any other medium, I would argue, visual medium, right? Because there's no photographs of stuff like this. There's no movie, right? I mean, you could reenact it with actors, but that's not really the same thing. Comics are able to give you a kind of an immediacy, right? The kind of thing that is, in a sense, it's precisely because it is a comic book, because it is drawn, that you're able to kind of get immersed in it in a very, very different way from any other medium. At least that's the argument. And again, I think also just look at the tones, how desaturated and washed out it all is, almost like a sepia tone. It also adds to that mood of inhumanity, I would argue. But I want to look particularly at one other thing that maybe does not pertain to other parts of Eastern Europe, and that is the question of what happens after the war in the Sudetenland. And so, as some of you may know, right, the Sudetenland was a place that was, well, it's controversial because it was a largely German population that was in this part of Czechoslovakia. After the war, of course, everybody hates the Germans, and the Czechs basically get together, both the state and a lot of just private citizens, to kick out thousands and thousands and thousands of Germans of this border region, right? And they don't just kick them out; they end up killing a lot of them, and it's a very, very painful episode, both for folks who were Germans, obviously, but also even for Czechs, and it's kind of a stain, right? Because they end up doing, as you see here by Cordell and Wolf, who kind of account for some of this, they end up doing to the Germans what the Germans had been doing to a lot of other people. And so there's even to this day a little bit of controversy. Maybe Dr. Biz has more information about it than I do, but there's controversy about even how many people were killed. The death accounts range from 30,000 all the way up to like 200,000. And it really kind of matters kind of who you're asking, right? Some folks are trying to maximize the number of dead for political reasons. Others are trying to minimize it also for political reasons. So it's kind of hard, right? But as they point out here, whatever the final death toll, the expulsion process was brutal and involved random as well as organized acts of terror against the remaining German population. These were civilians, of course. In the period between arrest and expulsion, ethnic Germans were rounded up and placed in the former German concentration camps, which were run according to the principles that the Germans themselves had employed. So clearly there was a revenge motive here, right? And in terms of just how to punish and ultimately kill the Germans there from the Sudetenland. So this is something, by the way, that's been explored in a lot of other media in recent Czech culture, in movies and in books. And so there's still, I think, a kind of coming to terms of this atrocity, right? And how it all came to be. So this is kind of Czech on German violence, right? And so comics, I think, were there at the forefront. And some of the stories in We Are Still at War, graphic novels like Bomber, and other ones are very much about the Sudetenland. Also, Alois Neville touches on the Sudetenland expulsion as well. But what's important is something that Martha Kuhlman writes about in her essay about Bomber, where she says, What's worth considering is how Jaromír 99 and Rudiš, these are the people who are behind these works, are themselves, their position, how they position themselves as narrators of this unspoken trauma. Because of course they didn't witness it, they weren't there. They might have relatives or something, but so in a way, this is all kind of being reconstructed long after the fact. Unlike Spiegelman or Joe Sacco, who are the American folks who also deal with kind of traumatic narratives very often, they do not call attention to their role as storytellers. The German expulsion is not their personal story, and thus it is very different from the situation of Spiegelman, who tries to convey the experiences of his father in Auschwitz, or Sacco in his role as a journalist in the former Yugoslavia and Palestine. So again, where we're getting into a little bit of the ethics, right, of representation here. Whose story is this, and how do you tell it? There's a lot of weight there. Now, of course, as I said, We Are Still at War gets around that ethical kind of issue by actually interviewing people who witnessed it, people who were in some cases victimized, and then telling their stories. And then this one, called The Massacre at Uzabitejo, the life of Rudy Bělohubek, who was a child witnessing this but survived. You get these kinds of accounts. Some of this is being drawn from photographs in some cases, but what's haunting about this, right, is this is the kind of imagery that we tend to see of the Holocaust, except this was happening after the Holocaust against Germans, right, rather than other ethnic groups. And you can see, right, in this account, how bloodthirsty a lot of the people were, right? We're saying that they want more of them killed, that they point at the little boy, he's German too, kill him too, right? And so this is kind of what it looks like, kind of more. What I found fascinating, again, is the use of the color and the glaring kind of bloody, almost kind of tone of this. What I also find striking is how this is also very, very much evocative of an earlier piece from 1955, which is considered, it's an American piece by Feldstein and Kriegstein, Impact #1, Master Race, which is the first, considered by some people, the first literary treatment of the Holocaust. And it happened in a comic book. It wasn't a movie, it wasn't a novel. It was a comic book that is all about these kinds of things. And you can see it was also about, it's about obviously the victimization of the Jews and others in the Holocaust, but even the same kind of color scheme, right, with the red is kind of striking. So you can see it a little bit better here, it seems to me. So clearly, right, there are certain tropes that they're accessing and certain kind of visual strategies for how to represent these kinds of atrocities. The difference, of course, is that we're used to seeing that with the Holocaust, but this is, of course, this is the Sudetenland thing. In Alois Nebel, again, just to return to that work for a second, you have a similar scene of the inhumanity that is meted out to the German citizens, right? As well as in Bomber, which has, according to its own account and their own research into some of this, it talks about some of the people who just decided to kill themselves rather than be tortured and killed and put into mass graves. So apparently up to 5,000, right, were basically German Sudetenland. Germans were committed suicide. So again, what's pretty hard hitting about this kind of stuff is again, right, the very kind of stark black and white kind of approach, but also just the fact that comics can be used for this kind of testimonial at all. And that's something that, again, was part of a very worked out strategy to expand the range of what was possible in comic art. And it's very, very exciting, particularly since the Czech Republic is a very small country. It's about 10 million people, right? That's pretty, it's a very small market. And yet, right, they were able to kind of basically target it and so well that now you have even regular bookstore, these kinds of works that are in there, right? And others. Not all the works are quite so heavy, but other things like Savages by Lucia Lomova, who is a very important older artist there. Her graphic novel, Savages, is about also a true story about a Paraguayan Indian named Cherwish who was brought over to Prague in the early 20th century. So it does get into questions of race and otherness and stuff, and there is some violence, but it's also just a very funny story about a kind of a fish out of water. So, right, and it's also just in terms of its look, right, very, very different. It's in color. A lot of the scenes take place during the day. It's a very vibrant work. Something else also from around that time, works that are not necessarily about the distant past, but about more recent events. And so this is Keva, which is part of a series of graphic novels that was put together by Wojtek Maszek, who's a very important artist and comics writer, as well as a couple of anthropologists. And this one is about the treatment and the experiences of the Roma, right, in there, which is a very much discriminated against ethnic minority in the Czech Republic and in other parts of Europe. But it's also done in collaboration with its subject, with a young woman who's named Keva. And so, right, Eve, so here we're starting to get into more the personal life, the personal experiences, rather than just these larger grand narratives, which of course, you know, they're treating both of them, right? But they're narrowing their focus more and more. I wanted to show you one more recent example. This is the most recent one that I'm talking about today in this vein, which is a graphic biography of a dissident during the communist era, Julius Varga. What's important about this work is, for me also, is that it is dealing with a subject who was disabled. And so the idea of a person who basically lived their life in a wheelchair because of a disease that they acquired in childhood, and yet could still be an effective leader and still be someone who could speak out against the communist dictatorship is a pretty important step, it seems to be, both for disability representation in Czech comics, as well as continuing this kind of vein where now the focus is more on an individual, right, rather than just these large questions. Of course, those large movements of history are still happening. So here, for example, we have him confronting a state security service agent, right? Even though he's in bed, he's kind of obviously looks kind of horizontal, and some might read that as a sort of a weak position, but he's still very defiant, right? They're shining these bright lights on him, and he says, "Hey, can you call my mother to bring me my dark glasses?" As he's saying, right? That's kind of what's going on there. And then something like this, where he gives a very famous speech late in the communist era. This is right before it was all going to collapse, but he is there in his wheelchair, speaking before a lot of people, kind of talking about the bright future that's come. So again, there's a little bit of hagiography, right? Like he's portrayed as kind of a saintly figure, which to me is a little bit of a problem, because disabled people are people like anybody else. They have flaws, right? But at the same time, right, he is a figure that is being listened to, someone that is active, and someone that is capable, right? So there's a lot in this work, and I get into some of these things in the chapter on this graphic biography. Okay, but you guys maybe are wondering, I've been talking about all of these episodes of trauma and all of these large historical kind of processes in Czech culture. There's one genre, however, that has been notable in Czech comics up until recently by being absent, and that is autobiocomics. Comics about individuals, about their own lives, which is a very common genre in a lot of European and North American comics. It's actually pretty ubiquitous. So the question, right, becomes, first of all, why were there no autobiocomics in the Czech scene? And then how does Jislova's Heartcore kind of play into this process? So Pavel Koržinek, who is one of the leading Czech comic studies specialists, was even writing about this around 2020 in the book that Dr. Biz mentioned, Comics of the New Europe, in his own chapter. He says, any kind of subjective personal recollection remains extremely rare. This is only 5 years ago, right? Czech comics seem, at least on their most superficial level, curiously depersonalized, desubjectivized, with genre and fictional works predominant. For some reason, there have emerged very few overtly personal autobiographical comics in the Czech tradition. So like I say, this is a little odd. This is a very, very common genre. I would even say a predominant genre in a lot of other traditions. In Japanese comics too, there's a lot of autobio. So why are the Czechs, and not only then, other Eastern European countries kind of lagging behind? Or is it lagging behind? We could always find exceptions. There were always shorter works and artists who were exploring their own personal experiences, putting them in comics form, in comics diaries. Lucia Lomova, again, she's an older artist, but she is someone who's, I think, been ahead of the curve in a lot of ways. And so she was doing these in various ways and putting them online starting about 10 years ago. And so this is an example of her stuff. And she would basically just pick a day of the week, Thursday, September 20th, 2018. And so that's what she would put up there, right? Or I'm sorry, September 30th in this case, right? And so it is just a little kind of episode of meeting someone that she thinks is a beggar. But after she gives him money, she thinks, well, maybe he's not a beggar. Maybe I embarrassed him. So it is the kind of thing that I think a little story that you can tell in a page of comics. She eventually collects a lot of these comics diary works and puts it into a book, right? Every Day is a New Day, a comics diary from 2022. And so you could argue that this is the first fully fledged real example of autobio comics of book length in the Czech Republic by Lucia Lomová. And it is kind of an interesting question as to why this work doesn't get the same attention as Heartcore. It's not been translated into English. Heartcore was translated within 2 years. So I don't know. Is it a generational thing? Lomová is in her 60s. She's been around a long time, whereas Jislová is still in her mid-30s, right? I don't know. Is that maybe the content is kind of less appealing for international readers? I don't know. But for whatever reason, this book is out in 2022, and you can talk about it in terms of an autobio comics practice. I couldn't resist, but I wanted to put this in here because I happen to know Lucia Lomová, and she put me in her comics. So this is me back in 2017 when we got together. Let me just read what she says. This is from her diary, her comics diary. A couple of years after I last saw him, a meeting with José Alaniz in Jericho Cafe, then we go to my place. After a glass of port, I can't help myself and I show him my diary. Sometimes my own exhibitionism makes me sick, but that's part of the game. I read aloud to him about myself. The phrase, then we go to my place, has completely different associations. Some, after the port, will take their clothes off. Others show you their diary. So it's obviously really disorienting, but kind of fun to see yourself represented in a comics work. It is a hazard of the work that we do because we interact with artists all the time. And sometimes they have their revenge by putting us in their comics. Okay, finally, for whatever reason, then, it is in 2021 that we get, I think, a more familiar and more, I think, conventional example of autobio, and that this is Bald from 2021. It is a collaborative work. It is Teresa Čechová, who is the writer, and Štěpánka Jislová, who is the artist, but it is about Čechová's experience. It is about her struggle with alopecia, which is an autoimmune disease that makes your hair fall out, right? And so all of the kind of identity issues and issues about her health and all of the panic and anxiety that brings up is in here. Bald, by the way, is the English translation. That's not exactly what the Czech original is. The Czech original is bez vlasu, which literally means without hair. Martha Kuhlman, who also translated this, she also translated Heartcore. We talked about this, but it was the English publisher was trying to kind of give people to think about the word bold, right? Bald and bold, right? Is what they were going for. I would have said hairless myself, but oh well, I didn't translate it. Anyway, here you have a page from Bald, and as you can see, right, it is a lot about that kind of identity kind of threat to what happens when you lose your hair. And also the story is a lot about just the pressure specifically on women, right? How it's very different for a woman to lose her hair than for a man. And all of the ways in which women, according to Čechová, are pressured to look perfect. And how alopecia, of course, puts a whole monkey wrench into all of that. So here she's trying all the different creams and different kinds of pills to try to stop it, but nothing is working. So she's very, very depressed. Anyway, so that then leads us to Heartcore. So notice that it's kind of been a long journey to get here in 2023 to what most people would now consider the first solo, full-length graphic memoir in the Czech scene, despite Lomová's Every Day is a New Day, right, that I mentioned before. This is the way that it's been talked about in reviews. It's the way that it's been kind of celebrated. It won all the major prizes in the Czech Republic for comics. And so, yeah, it's seen as a real breakthrough. And I think it's a remarkable work, as some of you guys have already gotten into it and can maybe tell me your impressions. The word Heartcore might seem kind of an odd neologism. Srdcovka is the original Czech. Srdcovka, which is a word that comes from the word for heart, right? Srdce. But Srdcovka is a slang term that means something that's very near and dear to you, but you also kind of understand that it's flawed. There's something wrong with it, but you still love it anyway. It's sort of like guilty pleasure, but a little bit more dark than that. Because of course, in the book, Sovka for her means her abusive relationship with her boyfriend, right? And this kind of problematic relationship that she kind of tries to navigate. Anyway, so it is, I think, a remarkable work. So who is Jislová? Just very quickly, she is born in 1992, as you can see. That's 3 years after 1989. That is 3 years after the collapse of communism. So she never lived in communist Czechoslovakia. She grew up very much in a Western kind of world, a world where the Czech Republic was trying to become more like France, more like Germany, more like England, more like America. And a lot of the comics that she grew up reading were not Czech. A lot of them were manga from Japan, probably stuff that maybe you guys have also read, stuff that was American. And so she represents a very different, I think, generation. And her experiences, I think, are different. She was also shaped by internet culture. She was social media, all of this stuff you see reflected in the graphic memoir. And a lot of times, a lot of that stuff is actually not for the better. Right? For me, Heartcore is a memoir partly about how the internet has just kind of ruined dating and made human relationships more shallow and more problematic. And it's, so there's, I think there's a kind of a critique there about how social media has kind of warped our senses of how to relate to each other as human beings. Let's talk just very briefly then about the theory of autobio comics or autobio in comics. So what does it mean when you have an artist who then tries to represent themselves? It's not at all a straightforward process if we start kind of digging into it, right? According to Charles Hetfield, he says, if autobiography has much to do with the way one's own self-image rubs up against the coarse facts of the outer world, then comics makes this contact immediate and graphic. We see how the cartoonist envisions him or herself. The inward vision takes an outward form. The graphic self-representation literalizes a process already implicit in prose autobiography, for the genre consists less in faithfulness to outward appearances, but more in the encounter between successive self-images and the world, right? That's an important phrase, successive self-images. So the guy or gal who is making their comics can represent themselves however they want, right? And it doesn't need to conform to whatever other people might be seeing. But of course, because it's comics, it's going to be successive self-images. Basically, that just is talking about how in comics, you have to keep drawing yourself over and over, right? It's going to be like 5 panels per page, 10 panels per page, whatever it might be, but you're going to have to keep drawing it. So it's a successive kind of process. It's never just one portrait of yourself. It's going to be hundreds or thousands, right? And so there's going to be kind of changes, right? You're never stable in comics exactly, right? And so a lot of that then echoes our own sense of fluidity in the outer world. Psychological fluidity, but also identity fluidity, all of that kind of stuff. Sexual fluidity too. The cartoon self-image then, he continues, seems to offer a unique way for the artist to recognize and externalize his or her subjectivity. When you put yourself into cartoon and tell a story about yourself, it's also a message to the reader about, in a sense, how you want to be perceived, or maybe how you fear you're perceived. Because a lot of autobio comics are actually about what a horrible person you are. That's certainly the way that they began in the undergrounds back in the late 60s and early 70s in works by Robert Crumb, for example. Notice that this is a classic panel from his work, My Troubles with Women, but you can see, right, it's a self-portrait, but he's not trying to look attractive or appealing. In fact, he's highlighting his big Coke bottle glasses. He's sweating. Look at the very nervous kind of line that Crumb uses for himself. He looks kind of manic, or maybe even, I don't know, disturbed. Yeah, Preston. Self-deprecating. Good word for it. Good word for it, right? And it's all about how he's so aroused by these girls in high school, but he can't date them. They won't pay attention to him. So he wants to take revenge in his comics. I'll show them all, like anybody cares, right? And so he even calls himself a bitter, twisted dude, right? So a lot of autobio comics, and this has been very influential, is about, in a sense, putting yourself in a bad light, showing how horrible you really are. Here in Canada, you guys have Joe Matt, right? And so many of his stories are basically about how he's addicted to masturbation. And then they're very uncomfortable and they're very kind of cringy, but it's all about self-revelation because the theory goes, right, that the worse you make yourself look, the more honest you seem. Because why would anybody be telling you these terrible personal things about themselves that are so revealing and so self-deprecating if they weren't true, right? That's that's in a sense the kind of bargain that gets struck here. That's the way autobio comics have often worked in a lot of Western European and North American comics culture. There's one other thing that I think is also important that's very relevant to hardcore. And that is really, in a sense, how you can read it as a kind of critique of this institution of love. Now, I know that it might seem quite startling and shocking to ever say anything against love, but there's actually a book by Laura Kipnis called Against Love, which is basically an argument, a very funny argument against this idea of how we put basically love on a pedestal in Western culture. In a way, it takes over the role of that God used to have, right? Love is the ultimate kind of goal. As she puts it, love is, as we know, a mysterious and controlling force, kind of like God, right? It has vast power over our thoughts and life decisions, kind of like God. It demands our loyalty, and we in turn freely comply. Saying no to love isn't simply heresy, very religious term, right? It is a tragedy, the failure to achieve what is most essentially human, right? If you're not paired off with someone, you're not just, a loser, you're also kind of a failure as a human. That's often the message, right? She says that you're given. So deeply internalized is our obedience to this most capricious despot that, kind of like God, that artists create passionate odes to its cruelty, and audiences seem never to tire of the most deeply unoriginal mass spectacles, devoted to rehearsing the litany of its torments, fixating their very beings in the narrowest glimmer of its fleeting satisfactions, right? So Kipnis is basically takes no prisoners, and she's not taking any BS, and she argues, I think, very vehemently in this polemic against love. I don't think that Jislová in Heartcore is going quite that far. However, there is definitely here a lot of problematic layers that she unearths with the modern sense of what love is, or what we call love, with dating, all of the things that you guys are digging into in the book. And I'd love to hear kind of some of your all's thoughts about this, right? I mean, you often wonder, I often did reading Heartcore, like why doesn't Štěpánka just kind of give up? Why does she just cut these people off? Why does she just keep going through all of these things? Why does she keep going on these dates that she clearly doesn't like, sleeping with people that she clearly doesn't like? And she herself will say it, well, it's kind of what people did. It kind of made me, she has a line in there where she says, well, being in a relationship was torture, but being not in a relationship was also torture, right? So this idea that there's a lot of social pressure as well. Okay, so all of that then brings us to Heartcore. For all of these reasons, what Heartcore is doing in terms of its self-representation, right, for the author, but also how ultimately she is not only interested in her own story. She wants to kind of touch upon how her story reflects larger historical trends. That puts her very much in the tradition of the stuff that I was talking about before. So it's a memoir, but it's also a memoir that, as she puts it herself, she wants to teach you something about what life today is like for young people, especially on the dating scene. For example, right, she'll have very, very melodramatic, almost kind of over-the-top representations like, I am so lonely, in all of these huge letters, right, collapsing. There's nothing worse, right, than just being alone, right? You're a failure, you're horrible, there's nothing, right? So this idea that there's so much anxiety and fear of being alone for her at that point that she'll take anybody, right? That kind of leads her towards all sorts of horrible choices. That plus alcohol and all these other things that she gets into. Comics, I think, also has devices and tools to represent interior states. This is, again, what we were talking about before, about how comics with words and pictures can approach states of trauma, extreme states of distress, and I think all sorts of original and fascinating ways. So this is an example where she not the first time, not the last time that her boyfriend Michal basically says he doesn't want to commit to her, when she thought they were doing really well and he was ready, like for to take the plunge. And so basically we see her face shocked in that first panel. She's clearly in a cafe or something, and then in the second panel, it all just kind of falls apart, right? It all just shatters, literally, right? That's not a literal, it's not that the glass of the windows is literally shattering, obviously, right? It's not a hurricane or something. It's clearly evoking her own inner collapse, right? And comics can do that very, very naturally, very, very organically, right? You can use this kind of symbolic language very, very easily in comic. It's a little harder in a movie. As this happened in a movie, it would be kind of bizarre and weird. And you might kind of be a little confused, like what exactly is going on. The other thing I would say is the colors, right? Notice that there's only two colors that get used, colors in their various variations, right? Their tones, red and blue, right? Which again have a lot of connotations for gender and heteronormativity, right? Blue for boys and red for girls, et cetera, or pink, that kind of thing. Other things like this, when her father dies and she hears about it, she's at the gym and she gets a text. Or sorry, she is told over the phone. And again, comics can do this kind of thing very easily. We get 4 different versions of her at different ages, and they're all basically, this is her memories, one could see, when her father's dying, thinking basically about how, well, my father always said he loved me, but he never really had time for me. And so at different ages, she's kind of contemplating all of this at the moment when she hears that he has died. Again, comics are able to do this to get at that sort of pain and hurt in ways that are very sort of formally inventive and visually, I think, fascinating and also very clear, right? We can understand where she's coming from here. Okay, but as I said, in this memoir, she is not just interested in telling you her story, how her heart was broken, et cetera, et cetera. She certainly does that, but it's also about, in a sense, teaching you something. And she says that when I interviewed her in Prague last year, she was really adamant about how even the publisher was saying, like, why do you want to do these sections of the book where you're talking about things like anxiety attachment, different kinds of attachments and different kinds of codependency? Like, that has kind of nothing to do with you. And she said, well, no, because I want people to understand that what happened to me happens to everybody. And there's reasons, right? And there's actual psychology into some of this. And so you have things that actually some reviewers have said really kind of stand out. They're not really kind of the best parts of the memoir. I'd be fascinated to hear what you guys think about it. But for her, it was like this was a necessary part of the memoir, where it kind of breaks from a kind of a standard memoir to really become more of almost like a pop psychology book about relationships and anxiety and attachments of various sorts. I love the memoir when it's doing things like this, things that only will work in comics, where you just have no background, it's all white. That makes no sense, right? Right? They got to be somewhere, but they're not, because this is a symbolic representation of the two of them. She in red, he in blue. They're almost like a yin-yang symbol. And notice how they're upside down relative to each other. They're looking in different directions. They're not even looking at the reader. But they're just barely touching fingers, right? She calls this the puzzle piece page. And for her, this is a kind of visual evocation of her relationship with Michal, right? That they're together and alone and together, as she puts it in the captions, right? And again, this is a very, on one level, it's kind of funny, right? On another, it looks ridiculous. It looks like they're in outer space or something, anti-gravity. But it's also, I think, really haunting and evocative and sad, right? And again, it's not just her story. She says a lot of relationships are like this, right? And she tries to get into some of the reasons for why. Okay, so there's one other part of this story that I want to talk about, and it's something that she referred to in her interview with me, and this is a little excerpt from it. She says, "This was one of the biggest questions I got after the book came out, about the ethics of autobiographies. After a while, I figured out that all autobiographies are unethical. That's just built into the premise. Even if you go around and ask people, is this okay? Can I have your consent to include this? Those people never really know how it's going to look in the book. Even if they give you consent, the way you might set up the scenes next to each other can give it a different context. So in the end, you never can make it 100% correct. But on the other hand, I strongly believe that you have an ultimate right to your own story, and how to tell it. So the way I conceptualize it in my head is these processes are parallel. They exist next to each other. And we can try to mitigate the hurt, the collateral damage, but it will always be only mitigation. That's a pretty bold, honest statement about any time you're telling your own story, and you're going to involve other people. And you're going to represent them too. And they might not like how you represent them. They might think you're lying about them, but now you're telling all these people, right, that are going to read your work. So, but she says that, hey, that's just, it's baked in. All autobiographies are unethical. Important. It's an important consideration, right? Because she accuses somebody in the memoir of raping her. Because part of what happens in the second half of Heartcore is that she tells us a very, very big and traumatic story that happens to her at a summer camp when she's a little girl. And she doesn't, it's not explicit. It's not showing it to you, but she uses this kind of visual language, right? The entire chapter is in red, right? Which is different from all the other chapters. And she'll use a kind of shattered glass with a void in it that's broken up into panels along this composition. And those bubbles, of course, are statements from her rapist, who are trying to rationalize, like, I didn't really rape you, you really wanted me to. Unconsciously, you gave me this, blah, all of this bullshit. But it's the kind of thing that rapists often will say. But it's getting at, in a sense, how deeply this affected her. But actually not even the event, she says, but actually the way that nobody would wanted to discuss it. And from there, right, she goes on to talk about things like rape culture in the Czech Republic, statistics, and how few of those rapes are reported, and then why? Because people don't, right? They don't want to disclose, because then they're going to be judged and in a sense blamed for causing it to begin with. So all of that stuff. And it's actually only as I was putting this presentation together, I've looked at this page a long time. It's only now that I realize, I think you can see it, right? It's an abstract image, but it looks like a face. It looks like Štěpánka's face, and the eyes are made up by the two word balloons in panels 3 and 4 in the second tier. See that? It almost looks like a kind of face. And that makes it really haunting, right? Because those word balloons don't contain her words, they contain her rapist's words. So it's a kind of visual evocation of a kind of scar that's kind of burned into her, seared into her by this person, who she has no relationship with, of course, but you know, he's a part of her life forever, she said, right? So it's a really, really disturbing, but also I think remarkable way to get at that kind of traumatic experience. Again, you can do this kind of stuff in comics uniquely. To finish up, so it's in this, towards the end of the memoir, again, that she really brings home this idea that this is not just my story. She wants to get across to the reader that ultimately a lot of the ways that why we have the kind of dating culture that we have, or the rape culture that we have, or all of these problems, it's not exactly only or exclusively social media. It's also just this baggage, this historical baggage, things like the World War II occupations, things like the Sudetenland expulsion, all of these kinds of atrocities of history that have really affected Czech people, and that have really, in a sense, affected their mental health, right? And so she has, in these wonderful little page white panels there, you have bullets representing war. You have all of these kind of detritus and cans and people of all those deficits and shortages that people have to live through, and hunger, right? She also talks in the bottom two panels about how both men and women are affected, but in different ways, right? And it's kind of affected the way that women, you know, are not allowed to have a particular kind of anger to stand up for themselves, she argues. And for boys, it's more a matter of how they're not allowed to have the full spectrum of their emotions, right? So both of them are kind of alienated from their own selves. And so all of this is, it's not something that happened, you know, 80, 90 years ago, right? It's stuff that still continues to be a burden for people even today. And it gets reflected in things like their inability to relate each other. So this is all a huge claim. This is going way beyond just her own story of heartbreak with Michal. But it's, like I said, she was adamant that she wants to give people the tools to connect these kinds of dots. So it's a very ambitious work in that way. Whether or not it works is a whole other question for you guys. That can only be answered by a reader. But she's definitely after a very, very big goal in this work. To finish up, I wanted to just pull back a little bit and talk about the question that I started with before. Like, so autobio has emerged in Czech comics and other Eastern European comic scenes only very recently, in some cases only in the 21st century, which is pretty remarkable, again, when you think about it, because we've had autobio comics over here since the 60s. And so here you have an example of some of them. Nikolai Maslov's in Russia was doing this in 2005. And you have Marzi, which is a series of graphic novels, kind of memoirs about growing up in the communist period in Poland by Marzyna Sowa and Sylvan Savoya. And then a more recent thing in Poland, which is Hagedorn and Efrasis' Totally Not Nostalgia, a memoir, which 2017 gets into kind of a queer identity and other kind of aspects of that life in Poland. But notice that they're all, they're no more than 20 years old. And two of them were not published originally in their country of origin. Maslov's book was published originally in France. Maslov's book has never been published in Russia, by the way. There was no reception, and this got no press and no attention in Russia, but it was published in France in French. And then in Poland, it was also originally published in French. It's since been published in Poland, right? So that tells you something, that there seems to have not really been a kind of native critical mass for autobio comics for a very long time, until only very, very recently. And it's still, in some cases, not as fully developed. And that opens up these fascinating questions about why. I talked a little bit about the notions of, they weren't free societies. There also tended to be not societies that were in Eastern Europe that were as individual focused, and that might have something to do with it. But ultimately, this is a question that I'm still mulling over myself, frankly. I would say that in specifically the Czech Republic, I think that one factor that is really important is that there was so much focus that was put starting around 2000 with looking particularly at questions of history, not individuals per se, but just large historical events. That were collective, right? There were traumas that affected everybody. And so in different ways. And so that seems to have been so much of the trajectory for it, that the idea of a person talking about arguing with their boyfriend or something, or girlfriend, just didn't seem to be as important in many ways compared to the Holocaust or compared to the Sudetenland explosion, something like that. That might have been part of it, right? That's just the way that the scene was kind of developed starting in the 2000s in a very conscious, like I said, strategy. And I think to some extent that might have affected why people felt on some level that was just not adequate or important enough material, right? My life to put in comics. We don't seem to have that problem over here, but it was an issue. And I'd be wonderful to see whether some of this resonates with the German experience over there, or East German at least. But let me finish up with a quote from Jislová, again, going back to her interview, because we talked about this, right? And she told me, well, I can only tell you about myself, right? It seems to me it takes a lot of time to make a book like Heartcore because you need to grow up on similar books. That's what happened to me because I'm a big fan of Tilly Walden, right? I really like Kate Beaton's Ducks, which is also very recent, right? Which is about Canada. And then I offered, and Alison Bechdel too. I said, yeah. And when I look back on how the process felt, it was partially built on these books, especially something like Fun Home, which is maybe a work some of you guys know, a classic work of graphic memoir from 2006. So yeah, I think you often need models to follow or not follow. And we had fewer of those models in Czech comics historically. All the examples I gave you are foreign. So that's her answer. She's saying, well, maybe I'm the first person in the Czech Republic to put out a graphic memoir because I was just reading these other comics, right? I was reading works that were foreign, where those folks foreigners don't have the same hangups about autobiography and comics that we seem to have in Czech Republic. And so that was very much what very organically led to my process. But it had to be something that was, strictly speaking, imported. It was not something that Czechs themselves necessarily were wanting to do. I don't know. I don't know. Like I said, I'm still thinking about it. I think maybe this is a good explanation for herself. I'm not sure that you can apply it to everybody or the entire scene, but it's something that I'm still kind of mulling over. That's basically it. So I welcome your questions. I sure hope you have some. So thank you very much.